As usual, the structure of our session will be as follows. I'm going to introduce our presenter, which is Paul Ashwin, who will speak for about 30 minutes. Then Bertha will respond as discussant, following which we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for the Q&A. So you're welcome to put questions and comments into the chat box during or after the presentation, and these will be addressed during the Q&A. At that time, you'll also have the opportunity to raise your hand and voice your questions directly if you want to. In the interest of bandwidth and connectivity, we ask that you keep your mic off at all times, except if you're asking a question later. And cameras can be switched off during the presentation and put on again afterwards. So in today's session, Paul is giving us an overview of his book, Transforming University Education, a Manifesto, in which he challenges readers to refocus on the purpose of university education. These days, it seems higher education is being pulled in so many different directions to meet a range of purposes to suit various stakeholders, and it's particularly focused on preparing employable graduates. There was an incident when I was working in a higher education institution, and I got called into a meeting with a member of management, together with a final year student and her parent. I knew that the meeting was linked to the student's academic performance. What I hadn't realized before going in there, however, was that I was to be placed in front of a verbal firing squad. I was insulted personally and criticized as to my professional and educational competence by both the student and her mother. The reason being that the student had failed the course. It was a compulsory credit-bearing one, and consequently, she had not met the criteria required to graduate. The personal attack was highly upsetting. It became clear to me that we were not there to discuss the student's options going forward, nor to talk about her poor attendance record, or to consider the barriers to her engagement with her work. Neither the student nor her mother were concerned about the learning or the knowledge development. They just wanted seamless access to the degree, to which my academic demands were a stumbling block. And equally, if not more upsetting, was the deafening silence from management, for whom it seems the greater concern was not to jeopardize keeping the proverbial bum in the seat. So what was the purpose of all those years of hard work? Paul's session today gets us back to focusing on the education part of higher education. Paul Ashwin is Professor of Higher Education and head of the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University. He's also Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education, the SARChI-HEHD, which is an international research centre headquartered at Oxford University. It comprises a partnership of 10 international universities, and the work they do is focused on higher education and its future development. Paul has done a fair amount of work in South Africa, and we know him from heading up the Higher Education Pathways project that involved Melanie Mikateko and a couple of other members from our centre, and produced this book in 2018, the South African Undergraduate Education and the Public Good. One of the projects Paul is currently working on is a large longitudinal study. It's an international collaboration researching curriculum, pedagogy, and student engagement in chemistry and chemical engineering degrees in universities in England, South Africa, and the USA. Paul's presentation today focuses on his manifesto. It is a response to questions such as those I asked when I came away from that hideous meeting. What is the point of what we are doing in higher education? And what is the value of a university degree? He does not expect or want us to agree with him. He actually says that in his book. He wants to provoke us to consider and debate the educational purpose of university and what we're trying to achieve. That we should worry about what is being taught and how it is being taught, in order that students have opportunities to engage with knowledge in such a way that it transforms each person's sense of who they are and what they can do. Paul, thank you so much for giving us your time. It's a real privilege to have you here, and we look forward to hearing your ideas and to being provoked.
Thanks, Fenella, and thanks for that really generous and comprehensive introduction that kind of links into lots of things I want to say, so thank you for that. I'll just try and share my screen and see how this works. So can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So as Fenella said, I'm going to try and give an overview of this book, and clearly the challenge of doing this is that in some ways you kind of end up overly simplifying what's going on and not getting into the detail. So I'm kind of aware of that as a challenge. So we'll face that challenge to work our way through. I'm slightly stumbling because the view on my screen has suddenly gone a bit odd and I can't actually see the slides, but let's see how we get on. And if that's a problem, I'll stop sharing and start sharing again. Okay, so let's try. There we go. So a couple of things to say about the book is that what it's trying to do is to bring together arguments and ideas from work that I've been doing probably over the last 20 years or so in higher education research. And it brings together work from many collective projects, the project in South Africa that Fenella mentioned that Melanie was involved in, work I've done with Monica McLean and Andrew Abbas in the UK, the current work I'm doing with partners in the United States, South Africa and at Lancaster, where we're looking at chemistry and chemical engineering. So lots of this is based on collective work, but obviously it's my take on that collective work. The other thing that the book does for me is it represents a kind of shift in my thinking over the 20 or so years I've been engaged in researching aspects of higher education. So when I came into this in my PhD, I was very focused on the notion of learning. And then over time, I began to look at teaching as well as learning. And then I wrote a book that kind of tried to look at teaching learning interactions and how those things came together. Then particularly with the work that I did with Monica McLean and Andrew Abbas, the kind of notion of curriculum and Basil Bernstein's ideas on curriculum became really important and kind of came to be a way of trying to think about teaching and learning more holistically and more in terms of its educational intentions. And now I'm really kind of asking questions about what does it mean to offer an education? And I've kind of gone on this journey from thinking about learning through to thinking about teaching and learning, through to thinking about curriculum, to now thinking about what does it mean to offer a university education. And the kind of central question in the lot of work that I've been doing, including the Pathways project that Fenella mentioned, is this question of how do we develop an inclusive, transformative higher education system rather than an elitist, reproductive one? And that question for me deliberately sets up some contrasts. So elite education, I would argue, is always reproductive. It always offers knowledge to those who are already in a position of privilege. And that if we want higher education to have a role in transforming society in different ways, and I realise that transformation has a particular meaning in South Africa that doesn't quite match the meaning of the way that I use it in the book. But if we want to have a transformative higher education system, then it needs to look at how everyone is given access to knowledge rather than focusing on the brightest and the best. And that's kind of the central question that I think about in this book, but clearly can't answer within a book, and it isn't for me to solely answer. As Fenella said, this is about provoking debate and having disagreements and discussions, although you could question how much my idea of disagreement and discussion is more comfortable in theory than it is in practice, but maybe in the questions and discussions we have after this presentation and after Bertha's response, then we can see how comfortable that disagreement is or isn't, and maybe it shouldn't be comfortable actually. So the kind of overall argument for the book is that the economic purposes have become to dominate the way that we think about a university degree, and that really so much is spoken about in terms of how a university degree prepares students for employment. And my argument is that's not what a university degree is trying to do educationally. That doesn't mean that getting a job isn't important. That doesn't mean that as a byproduct of doing a degree, students don't become more employable. They clearly do. But simply the argument is the way in which a university degree is designed, it's focused not on preparing students for a job, but it's designed at its best for bringing students into a transformative relationship to knowledge. And further, when we focus on the economic purposes of a university education, what we do is we get caught in this situation where we mistake social privilege for ability in students and institutional prestige for quality in universities. So what we do is we say, okay, let's have an elite education in which we take the brightest and the best, and they go to the best universities. But because of the way in which social privilege and academic performance are deeply entwined, if we do that, then we tend to focus on the most privileged students. And also, given the history and differences in wealth of institutions, if we focus on the institutions that are supposed to be the best, then what we do is we actually focused on the most prestigious universities rather than actually where the high quality education is on offer. So we get caught in this trap where actually we're simply reinforcing privilege in students and we're reinforcing the prestige of already wealthy institutions. And the overall effect of that is that going to university gets positioned as a form of social selection, that it isn't really about what happens educationally for students at university. It's simply about getting a certificate that you can trade in for a job at the end of it. And this has led to a number of books. So recently, Brian Kaplan in the States in 2018 published a book called Against Education, The Case Against Education, in which he basically says in a very privileged way, well, given that all knowledge is available on the internet, then, and given that most people use the internet not to gain knowledge, then it shows that people aren't really interested. So why do we need education? And unless we really focus on what a university offers students educationally, then actually we leave a great deal of space for those kinds of undermining arguments that in fact further reinforce privilege to really take hold. So what I'm trying to do in the book is to say, okay, what is it that a university is trying to do educationally? And as Fenella mentioned, this is intended to support debate and disagreement rather than trying to encourage people to adopt the Ashwin way of seeing this. I really am not interested in that. What I'm interested in is how we collectively develop arguments about what a university education is for. And part of that response might be, well, actually, Paul, you're completely wrong. And employment is so important for people's future life chances that needs to be at the heart of what a university education offers. And my response to that would be, okay, fair enough. But if that's what it's for, then it needs to be completely redesigned, because that's not currently what it aims to do. So part of what I do in the book is in the kind of first half, I set out a series of myths about a university education that kind of undermine the potential to think about it educationally. So as I've already mentioned, in terms of the educational purposes, this is very much about seeing it in terms of producing employable graduates. And there's a number of kind of forms of mythic thinking that relate to that. So in the English context, the government will talk a lot about graduate premiums, about the differences between how much university graduates earn compared to non-graduates. And this is supposed to be a measure of the quality of the university education. But the reason that's a form of mythic thinking is that actually graduate premiums are a measure of inequality. So the societies with the highest graduate premiums in the world, I think chemical engineering in South Africa might have the highest graduate premiums in the world, or it certainly used to, but those graduate premiums exist in the countries with the highest levels of inequality. So where countries have less inequality, the graduate premiums are lower. And do we really want to argue for a university education based on its role in increasing inequality in society. So there's kind of a series of myths about those kind of educational purposes. Then I look at the myths in terms of the educational processes offered by universities, and I kind of look at the way in which this is presented in a kind of series of myths that I've grouped together here in terms of individual inspirational teachers using perfect teaching methods to teach naturally brilliant students. So the idea that really university teaching is about the individual inspiring teacher who lectures magnificently and changes the kind of souls of their students forever. It's not really about that. It's about designing curricula that draw on a range of teachers who collectively come together with other professionals to work out ways of enabling their students to develop understanding. It's not about the perfect teaching method. It's about, you know, the right way of introducing these students to this form of knowledge. And there's no one method for that. There's kind of different ways of doing that according to what the knowledge is and who the students are. And then finally, the idea that higher education should simply be about naturally brilliant students, again, is just a way of reinforcing privilege. You know, my understanding of our educational responsibilities is that we look at the students we have and we work out ways of developing understanding. You know, and a very, very old educational principle is, you know, find out your students' current level of understanding and teach appropriately, rather than saying, oh, well, these students aren't good enough, really, you know, there's something wrong. You know, to me, our educational responsibility is to actually find a pathway of understanding based on what students currently understand. And then finally, a chapter where I look at myths around measure of quality of that education, the way that things like university rankings are positioned as an objective, precise, laser-like indicator of quality, whereas really they're nothing of the kind, you know. So if we take university rankings as an example, you know, actually the major purpose of commercial university rankings is to sell things, is not to measure. You know, so you know, you have to understand them in those terms. And what they do is they take a series of unrelated objects together, unrelated measures together, and produce them into kind of a single ranking. So it's a bit like if you had a football league table that wasn't based on the outcomes of matches, but was based on the outcomes of matches, the size of the crowd, the quality of the catering, the quality of the pitch, and all of those things were aggregated together and then reduced down to a single number. If football league tables did that, then university rankings would be like football league tables. But the fact they don't, because that's nonsense, shows what a load of nonsense university rankings are. And as I go on to say a bit more about, you know, it's to the eternal shame of universities that we treat these things as if they say something meaningful. I say in the book, I use George Orwell's notion of doublethink, the idea that you say something you know is untrue up until the moment that its untruth becomes clear, and then you back away. And that's just what universities do with university rankings. They accept that they're not meaningful measures, but when they do well in them, they put their performance on every platform, social media window they can get access to. And as I say, I think that completely undermines what universities are trying to do. So my way of kind of bringing together the transformational power of a university education is that it's about introducing students to collective bodies of knowledge that change their ways of understanding the world. And the fact these are collective bodies of knowledge that have a structure, you know, they're not facts, they're not generic skills, but they're collective bodies of knowledge that have been produced over centuries by many different people, is key to what higher education does. It gives students access to that knowledge that changes students' sense of who they are, changes what they can do in the world. Clearly, not everything that students gain from going to university or engaging in higher education is about that knowledge, which is why there's also a link between students and the world. But for me, if we're going to talk about university education being transformational, it's that engagement with knowledge that changes students' sense of who they are and what they can do in the world that's the key aspect of that transformation. So this way of understanding a university education kind of gives us certain kinds of educational responsibilities. So the way I kind of bring together this understanding of these responsibilities is to say that it's about how we ensure our degree programs are well designed and based on evidence-informed views of who our students really are, not who we wish they were, not who they were 5 years ago, but who are the students we have now, and what are their current levels of understanding, what are their current passions, and how do we design a degree program to harness that potential. That we base the design of these degree programs on a sense of how and why the knowledge we offer students access to is important and powerful, how it enables students to understand and change the world. And if the knowledge we're offering students access to isn't important and powerful, if it doesn't enable students to understand and change the world, then why is it part of our degree programs? Why are we not actually focusing on the things that we think are the most important and most powerful in designing an education for students? And then finally, having a sense of who our students will become through their engagement with their knowledge, how they contribute to society, which will include their employment, but will also include other aspects, involvement in democratic institutions, involvement in community groups. You know, who do we think our students will become through their engagement with this knowledge? Now, it's really important to be clear that this isn't to set limits on who students will become. Students will change in ways we don't expect. But it's simply to say that if we're saying to students, come and study with us, come and see what this knowledge can do, then we need to have a sense of what we think that knowledge will do. Not limited to a list of famous alumni, but actually based on an understanding of what, you know, our students go out and do in the world as a collective whole after they've engaged with our education. And for me, this kind of raises questions about the ongoing relationship between universities and their graduates after graduation. You know, it's important to recognise that this kind of agenda I'm putting forward here is really difficult. You know, this is not something that's easy to do. It's not supported by ideas of best practice, as if there's only one way of doing it. You know, it's something that has to take part with groups of people working together, and it's intellectual work, and it involves trying things and realizing they don't quite work, and trying them again, and kind of dialogue with students, with learning technologists, with education developers, with academics on programs, all coming together collectively to try and work out how to do this in a good enough way. You know, and all the kind of talk of excellence and, you know, brilliant teaching, in fact, gets in the way of the kind of nature of this as a process, which is kind of far more kind of a mixture of success and failure for everyone than it is a kind of idea that there are some brilliant teachers and some who are hopeless, and kind of, you know, you're either one or the other. It's a far more kind of juddery kind of, you know, process in which sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. And then the final thing to say about this is that I've really emphasized degree programs as a whole. And for me, the way in which so often higher education gets thought about in terms of individual modules, or the current debates around micro-credentials, where it's about bits of knowledge, to me, doesn't lead to the kind of transformation that I'm arguing for. There has to be a programmatic nature of a university degree that takes place over a number of years, with that design being thought about in terms of that program over the years. And if you just have a collection of modules that doesn't have an educational intention, then you don't get that transformational power that I'm arguing for. And then this kind of leads to a kind of sense of the responsibilities of universities that I kind of cover towards the end of the book, where I kind of set out the manifesto. And this kind of, in a way, this could, the vision I'm presenting here of the responsibilities of the universities could be positioned as a kind of quite colonial, quite old view of a university, but to me, it kind of speaks to what universities do in society. And so my argument is that, universities are the institution that has a unique responsibility for looking after knowledge in society. Okay, that is what we do. We look after, and we have stewardship over the collective bodies of knowledge that have been produced by many people in many countries over many, many years. And we have a responsibility of working with society to give everyone access to that knowledge and to work out what that knowledge can do for everyone in society. So that's a really important responsibility that universities have. And with it come a kind of number of implications for what universities shouldn't do. So given that we are so focused on knowledge and kind of collective bodies of knowledge that we take seriously, then we shouldn't be overclaiming the benefits of higher education. We shouldn't be making bland statements about what higher education can do unless we have a clear sense of what higher education actually does. We shouldn't be kind of saying, oh, well, it's okay to use university rankings for marketing when we know they're based on completely flawed measures. We have a responsibility to say, actually, that doesn't tell you about the quality of the education we offer, but this does. Looking about how our curricula leads you to a particular form of understanding, that does give you an insight into its quality. So we kind of have to take that responsibility seriously and realize that universities, we're not politicians, we're not marketers, we are part of an institution that is responsible for knowledge. And that means there are certain things that politicians or marketers might say that universities shouldn't say because of their incredibly important responsibility for looking after knowledge. And so for me, this means that we need to have an honest conversation about the potential and the limits of a university education. A university education can't do everything. Too often universities kind of get into a conversation with governments where governments have a policy agenda and they say to universities, well, can you do this? And universities say, well, if you give us the money, yeah, of course we can do it. And to me, actually, there are certain things that other forms of education, other parts of society are actually better equipped to and better focused on than universities are and higher education is as a form of education. And actually, if we want to develop inclusive, transformative higher education systems, part of that challenge is actually being clear about what a university education can do and what it can't do, rather than kind of making these grandiose claims that actually are are not connected to evidence we have about what a university education can do. So so I hope I've now stopped sharing my screen, have I?
Yes, you have.
So yeah, so hopefully that gives you a kind of insight into the book and kind of where the argument's going. I'm really looking forward to hearing Bertha's comments, and I'd also like to thank Bertha for all the help she's given me in arranging this. It's been great, so thanks for that, Bertha. And then I look forward to hearing other people's comments and questions. So I hope that was helpful.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think it certainly is food for discussion. So I'll hand straight over to Bertha and we'll hear from her. Thanks, Bertha.
Thanks, Vanilla, and thank you, Paul, for this very fascinating and knowledgeable presentation. I've always been intrigued by the discussions on rethinking the purpose of higher education, whether it's a discussion about higher education as the public good, common good, or this notion that I came across recently, trying to redefine higher education as anchor institutions. Now, because I did my PhD research on the purpose of higher education in Tanzania, listening to your presentation today has mostly been like I'm listening to part of my literature review and constantly asking myself about the higher education in sub-Saharan Africa, or how about Tanzanian context, except that for now I have few answers to those questions, although it doesn't really mean it's the end of this of the discussion or even to think about this. So in this presentation, you criticize the dominant understanding of the role of higher education, which mostly focuses on the economic perspective. And similar to the argument I presented in my PhD thesis and the work done by other scholars like Bond and Walker 2013 and 2016, and even the most of the research work done by our research groups, you argue that higher education should also focus on the expanding and transforming students' knowledge and their worldview. This means developing individuals who would contribute to and gain from the economy and contribute to the society. So what I find pretty interesting is that you do not necessarily ignore the economic benefits of higher education, because you still urge universities to produce individuals who contribute and gain from the economy. But clearly, this is not the only benefit of higher education. This reminds me to Sen's argument that in as much as economic or market focus is important in enhancing the lives of people, it's also important to appreciate the role of social and political freedoms in improving the lives that are people, improving the life people are able to lead. Therefore, it's also essential to appreciate other social benefits of higher education. And what I got from your presentation in your analysis, I would say you indicate that the disciplinary knowledge needs to be made meaningful to students by outlining its relationship to work, society, and more broadly to the students themselves. And also curriculum should be structured to highlight this relation and to allow access by diverse student bodies. Therefore, I think what's key from your book or presentation rather is that higher education should assist students in seeing the world differently. Higher education should also help students to understand themselves and their relationship to students, to society, so that they can understand themselves in new and beneficial ways for their future actions. Despite of all these really useful arguments that you have presented, I also had some questions, and part of the first of all, I think you have replied to this question when you started your presentation, because I was still wondering where you draw the arguments on this book, and I was asking myself, was it an empirical study, or what really intrigued you to this book? And I think you have indicated that this, you draw this from number of projects that you're part of, and yeah. So I think you responded to that. But I'm also wondering, then was there any theoretical conceptualization that helped you to come down to this argument that you presented? And also, I'm also trying. Okay, another thing is that we have been having this discussion back and forth. I remember even from the public good conference that we had in Cape Town that Fenella mentioned at the beginning. We have been having this discussion, but my only question is that how do we really disseminate this kind of knowledge? How do we make sure that this argument and this thought are really put into action? And I'm now wondering, have you thought of any, or what have you done or planning to do so far, so that we can really see what we're arguing to be put into action? And also, but I'm also asking myself here, was this book intentionally meant for, let's say, was it for students or was it for policymakers? What was the I don't want to say center, but what was really, when you're writing this book, what was the focus of or the group that you intended to have effect on the was it students, was it policymakers, or let's say university administration, or what was really the point of that? I think I can't really structure that question, but I think you're getting it. So I'll say this presentation has really been helpful for me and really interesting. Again, thank you very much for a very thoughtful and ideas for us to keep on thinking about the role of higher education, especially in these times of globalization and knowledge economy, where we only think about the economic benefits of higher education. I think it's really crucial to broadly acknowledge and understand what universities can do without disregarding other potentials. To finish my discussion, I'll quote Nyerere's words when he was trying to define what universities should do. And he said, the role of a university in a developing countries is to contribute, to give ideas, manpower, and to service for the furtherance of human equality, human dignity, and human development. I think this quote really fits into your presentation and what most of us are trying to do, to rethink and to reconceptualize the purpose of higher education. Thank you.
Thanks, Bertha. Fennell, are you okay if I just give a quick response to Bertha's
Yes.
Insightful comments? So thanks, Bertha. Yeah, so as you say, kind of, yeah, the book tries to bring together a number of empirical projects I was involved with before, a kind of reading of the literature, and tries to put them together and kind of as a whole. You asked about the theories that kind of inform the thinking. There's kind of two avenues to that. So there's the kind of work in relation to Basil Bernstein that I engaged with Monica McLean and Andrew Abbas, and that way of thinking about the way in which knowledge is transformed from knowledge production through research into kind of curriculum, and how knowledge gets transformed when it gets placed in a curriculum and no longer has the same logic, and how it's then transformed again when students engage with it. So those kind of ideas were key. And then also a book, kind of very old book now, by John Bowden and Ferenc Martin, called The University of Learning, where they ask the question, what's the point of a university degree if lots of the things students learn are going to be out of date by the time they graduate or a few years after graduation? And they argue that it's the ways of seeing the world that university gives students are absolutely key. And that kind of books and that's I know you use capability theory in a different way. They also called that capability theory, and it means something else. But that form of capability theory, kind of in terms of the purpose of a university education being a way of seeing the world, and and they basically say it's so that it's, having done a degree, you can go into a situation as a chemist and you can focus on what's crucial in that situation, or you can go into a situation as a sociologist and focus on what's crucial in that situation as a sociologist, and those things will be different according to what you've studied at university, because you'll see the world in a different way. In terms of how to put the argument into action, there's kind of a number of elements for me. So there's first of all the kind of research that I'm now doing, where I'm trying to look at different subject areas and understanding how engagement with knowledge changes the way students see the world. So there's a kind of, and other people have done research in that as well, and the kind of work you're doing at University of Free State also speaks to this, about understanding how different degrees lead to different outcomes for students, so that we have a richer sense of that relationship between knowledge and outcomes. So there's that. There's also kind of part of what I would argue is, certainly in the UK, most academic development takes place at the level of an individual. The people do courses on how to be a teacher. And actually, I think a lot of that is largely a waste of resource. And that actually a far better way, based on these arguments, of doing academic development would be collectively to get people together to redesign their degrees, to get academics, students, academic developers, learning technologists together and to take a degree and to say, well, what kind of students, what kind of graduates are we trying to produce here? And how is this degree designed to do that? And how can we change that design of the degree to actually allow it to be more effective and to meet the kind of aspirations that we have and our students have for engaging with this knowledge. So that would be another form of action. And then the third form of action kind of relates to your question about who is the book for and what is the audience, is the kind of, in a way, I think this kind of heart of this book are people who are working in higher education but aren't kind of part of higher education studies or higher education research. And part of my kind of argument and why it relates to the kind of call for action is that academics, you know, and I realise plenty of other people work in university who aren't academics, but if we just take academics for now, academics are the most highly educated workforce in the world. And the fact that academics talk about what's done to them and how unfair it is, and these things aren't right, and often do that in a way that sometimes suggests they're powerless, to me is, you know, is kind of very depressing. And also my view of working in higher education is that it's a privilege. It's an absolute privilege to work in higher education. And the responsibility of that privilege isn't to apologise for it, it's to say, well, what are we doing with that privilege? How are we making use of that privilege to do something different? And so part of the book is a call for action, is to say, we need to make these arguments about what a university education is. And we need to state them and share them with other people and, you know, open up to the possibility we're wrong, open up to the possibility that we might be wrong, but we might be right, but our arguments won't have an effect, but actually engage far more in public debates about what a university education can do for people and where its limits lie. So it's trying to say, you know, let's take the privilege that academics have in universities and do something with it that kind of shows how seriously we take our responsibility for looking after knowledge and for making it as accessible as it can be for everyone in society. So I kind of hope that kind of responds to your questions, and thank you for the kind of, you know, deep engagement that you've shown with the ideas.
Thank you, Paul. I think you have given me even more ideas to include in my book. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Bertha, and for I think very I think provocative and thought-provoking discussion between the two of you. I think it's enriched the discussion, enriched the presentation, with all due respect, Paul, but I think it was a good platform. So we're going to open up for questions, and I see Melanie has her hand up. So Melanie, Paul, would you like to take one question at a time, or how many? How would you like to do it?
Let's try one at a time, and if it gets too stop-starty, we can then move.
Okay, so we've got a question from Melanie, and then I see Carmen, and then Erasmus.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was a really nice presentation, really well put. I've read the book, and I thought the way you managed to condense the book into the presentation was really very nice. I want to raise something which also occurred to me when I was reading the book. So on the one hand, I'm hugely sympathetic to the argument that you're putting forward, that curriculum needs to be properly designed, so it's sequential, progressive, and all those sorts of things, and not just a dot and dash makeup of modules. And that the knowledge that students gain at university has the potential to change them and to change the way they look at the world. My sense is that this might be a stronger argument in relation to professional degrees, but I'm not entirely sure. The challenge that I have is what happens when your argument meets inequality. So both inequalities among staff. So the notion of a group of lecturers and students and whoever getting together to redesign the curriculum assumes some kind of shared understanding of where they want to go. And I think so much would need to be sorted out. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but I think it would be a really complex process. I think it comes up against the challenge of who decides which knowledge and whose knowledge is important, and how one deals then with the debates around decolonization and so on. And what you do in a context like ours, where the massive social inequalities translate into massive schooling inequalities, so that students who come through to universities come with very, very uneven backgrounds, which I think aren't taken into account and should. So I agree with that. So I'm just trying to think through, what would the challenges be for us? Policy hasn't really focused on curriculum, not surprisingly, I guess, because it's left to individual universities, and the focus has been issues of redress and so on. And then in Chrissy Bowie's and Sue McKenna's recent book, I think they quite rightly say that the higher education system has failed. So I find the argument hugely appealing, but I just wonder what happens when the argument meets inequalities of different kinds. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's a great question. And I think, that kind of, you have to, as I kind of tried to say in the presentation in the book, is you have to recognize how difficult that is. And kind of, for me, it's kind of incredibly important to try and to have those debates and to recognize the difficulty of those debates. And that in lots of contexts would be a massive step forward, because actually recognizing the difficulty of that is something that's smoothed away and presented as if somehow this is incredibly easy. In kind of the debates about decolonizing the curriculum, I completely agree. They're really important debates and they're difficult, and we have to look at how we approach them. And part of that has to be to recognize that academics have particular forms of expertise that inform the design of their curricula. And part of the reason students want access to universities is to get access to that expertise. So there's no point in that debate in making it easy, going, oh, well, my students are as expert as I am, and we can design this together. Well, if that's the case, why are you getting paid and they're not? So to me, it's about recognizing that within those discussions, people have different forms of expertise, and it's those forms of expertise that introduce them to that discussion. But as you say, that's incredibly difficult. You'll have times when that happens where it goes incredibly badly and does a lot of damage, and you'll have other times when it goes brilliantly, and that kind of, in a way, mirrors the current situation as well. So there's a real balance between kind of, there's dangers whichever way you go, and there's huge injustices and violence done currently, and wherever you move to, there'll be other violence and injustices that come up at that way. So there is no safe place, and it's part of recognizing that, why I generally say this is about offering a position for contestation and disagreement, because there has to be collective agreement about how you move forward, and it's not about one vision. But but kind of trying to do that with integrity and honesty, to me at least, feels that we're taking the responsibility that we owe to knowledge. You know, we're disciplined by knowledge, and we recognize that gives us responsibilities for what we're trying to do. And we're equally open that sometimes that's just not going to work. You know, it's...
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Melanie. Carmen, do you want to voice your question?
Yes. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for this really interesting presentation. I think it was really provoking, and I attended as well a book launch that you did a few months ago, and it was great to hear about you and your book. I just want to make a comment. Of course, you know, it might not even be relevant because I haven't read the book. But when you were talking, I was wondering, where is the higher education that you're talking about rooted contextually or geographically? And this, I guess, it links my comments to, you know, ways of being and educating in the global South, and also to alternative higher education systems as indigenous systems in Latin America. So I guess I was wondering, because I'm really equally, as Melanie was telling, I'm really sympathetic with all your ideas. And I think much of my work under the capabilities research has been about defending the collective knowledge creation among small groups of people, so we can really, you know, create multi-epistemic knowledge that is related to the values, the local values and the local cosmovisions. But yeah, I mean, the fact that the book is talking about higher education generally, it was all the time, you know, coming back to me like, do we need to situate this critique of higher education as a Western higher education system? And can we maybe say that given the different ways in which education is produced and is effective in many global South contexts, is it not this already being done in global South context? I mean, of course, I'm talking about the different aspects that you were discussing, not only the co-creation of the curriculum, but also seeing beyond the economic. I mean, I'm thinking about indigenous universities that are not really connected with the economic benefit of higher education and so on. So, but thank you so much. I mean, I found it really, really interesting, and I'm looking forward to read the book.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Carmen. Yeah, no, I would not claim that there's anything particularly new or original in the arguments I'm making in the book. It's kind of, you know, and I think for all social science, you know, there's kind of ideas that are new to a particular context and have been done elsewhere. You know, that's kind of the space we move in. So I'd completely accept that. And as I say kind of in the introduction to the book, that it's kind of, you know, it's very English. You know, I have experience, as Fenella mentioned, kind of, I've done some work in South Africa. I have knowledge of European systems. In the book, I draw on an international body of research, but that, you know, as I say in the introduction, that's research based in English because I'm embarrassingly monolingual, and that means my knowledge of South American higher education is incredibly limited. So it's my particular take and perspective, and that's all it should be seen as. You know, and again, the kind of temptation to offer a totalizing view gets in the way here. So actually, those other examples, those other ways of engaging and how they change the argument, to me, is incredibly exciting, and that's where you go next. So, you know, if you care to share those, I'd be delighted to hear them. You know, so and with all of these things, kind of, that's what people do with knowledge. They take it and they make it their own and they transform it and they do something new. And that's what we're all doing. And that's where our limits lie, but it's also where the kind of exciting potential lies. So that's a very long-winded way of agreeing with you.
Thanks, Paul. I think what I'm appreciating is that you're not scared to go into this really scary and difficult terrain, and to keep prodding and poking and saying, let's try, because one is easily scared off when it's this hard.
Well, my feeling is that in the end, we're all wrong, we're all dead, and we're all forgotten. So we've got to do what we think is important and kind of accept that along the way, some of that is going to be wrong. And providing the reasons are right, you know, the human condition is that's the best you can hope for. It's kind of, you know, it's difficult for everyone, and clearly it's much, much more difficult for some people than others.
Thanks. Erasmus, we'll hear from you now. I see hands from Tiffany and Gabby and Prof. Narant, and we'll go in that order. So Erasmus, thanks.
All right. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
Mine is more of a compliment, and that compliment you also get, maybe if possible, you may answer one or two things that bother me when we talk about universities. And I do appreciate the effort that you have made, and I've talked about the importance of university, and especially to limit it to what I might call the humanizing aspect. Universities have more to do with human aspect and all that. But I don't know how you take this. This is more of feeling that perhaps people in the global south, developing countries might have. Universities, whether we like it or not, or going to university is seen as a way of economic development, a bridge from poverty to a moderate kind of living. And this is the truth. So when you see someone going to university from a poor background, it really means they are more interested in the economic aspect. And there have been comments to the extent that university education is seen more of as an elitist approach to human living. And you know, I'm not sure how to put it across, but this is exactly perhaps something which we have to which perhaps intellectuals have to fight to try to dispel. Perhaps it's a myth, as you said, the three myths that you talked about, kind of. So I find it, how do we reconcile poverty, university education together? You know, these are kind of, and perhaps better living. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to talk about livelihood that talks about human rights and all that, yet people will tell you that my interest is just in making it through, that my family survives. You know, these are kind of, that's why I said it may be a question, maybe if you can answer that perhaps, but if you can't, it's still okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Erasmus. So no, I mean, clearly the kind of popularity and value placed on higher education by, you know, by kind of many people in most societies is about the economic benefits. So that is clearly incredibly important. Kind of my argument is that is a legitimate expectation of higher education, but it's not what it's trying to do educationally. And it kind of, so I kind of struggle to find a way to say this kind of clearly, but it's kind of the sense of, you know, certainly in the research I'm doing, where we've tracked students longitudinally through their degrees, is that if you look at how students develop kind of a really transformative relationship to knowledge, an element of that is students understanding that they're at university to be changed, you know, and that it's an educational process. And where students don't see going to university in that way, and we've seen this examples of students in England, students in the United States, students in South Africa, where they don't expect to be changed and they don't understand its education process, they benefit far less from going to university. So for me, there's an element of, if you simply see it in economic terms and don't understand that there's a relationship for which students and the institution both have responsibility, higher education doesn't do what it could do. So that's kind of a part of the argument, is that you know, that if you kind of just present it in terms of getting a certificate and you don't understand it actually, that there's a process of education that's key to those benefits, then actually, you know, it's you know, higher education probably isn't worth the money. You know, it's kind of, so nothing I'm saying is trying to say, well, no, you shouldn't see it as an economic benefit. It's just that in educational terms, that's not what it's trying to do.
Thanks, Paul. We're getting tight on time. So can I ask Tiffany and Gabby and Prof. Noren to ask their questions, at least get the chance to voice them, and then maybe by way of answer, your response would sum up the session for us. So if you three can ask your questions and keep it fairly quick and to the point, please. Tiffany? Tiffany?
Perhaps the mic is off.
All right. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can. Hello, can you hear me?
Tiffany, we can't hear you well. Could you maybe put your question into a chat, and then at least Paul might be able to consider it if we don't get back to you. The connectivity just doesn't seem to be able to take your voice. Gabby, can we hear your question?
Thanks, Fenella, and thank you, Paul. Really interesting. So my question is about employment, and why don't we think about employment more holistically? Jan MacArthur wrote a brilliant piece for Wonky recently saying why we need liberal arts education because of the crisis in Afghanistan, and saying that we don't understand history, we don't understand culture, we don't have so many skills we need to communicate with people, but we don't think of diplomacy and conflict resolution and that kind of stuff as employment. But putting it in capability terms, if people have the capability to be and do what they want to be and do, that can include a much wider range than is currently considered as viable employment in, say, neoliberal terms in the UK. I'll stop there. Thank you.
If I may go, Fenella. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion, and hi there, Paul. I'll try to make this as quick as possible, but I think we probably need more time to tease out the ideas. I get the impression that you've focused quite a lot on the individual transformation aspect. And my question really relates to the earlier question by Melanie. And this is about the how universities themselves become transformed in society, because you know the needs of society, or not only the needs, but you know, economy, politics, culture, science, all of these are in a state of flux all the time, changing all the time. So you have to turn the gaze, in my view, to how universities are changing and should change, rather than just focused on the individual change. Let me stop there.
Okay. Okay, so I'll answer those, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat, and so if the question comes in from Tiffany, I'll try and answer that. Yeah, no, I completely agree with Gabby that we need to focus on employability more widely. In a way, kind of what I do in the book is I take employability to mean graduate earnings, which is kind of a bit of an easy slip and allows me to make the argument. But clearly, if you had a wider definition of employability, then the argument isn't so straightforward. So there's a kind of, I'm kind of using it as a device, but I completely agree that if you had a wider notion of employability, then you get into a more interesting conversation about how higher education contributes to that. And really, part of what I'm saying is that if higher education is saying it contributes to employability, then it just has a responsibility to say what the mechanism is for that happening. And if it can argue for that mechanism and show it, then I've got no issue. But simply to go from doing a degree to earnings is just, is just a measure of privilege as far as I can see, rather than a measure of educational benefit. And in terms of the question about should we be moving beyond individual transformation to institutions, I'd actually take it further. Where my thinking is now going is about what higher education systems or tertiary education systems look like that are transformative. To me, within higher education research, universities are incredibly noisy institutions and take up so much of our thinking. And for me, it's far more important to think about, well, what is a national system of tertiary higher education? How does that give everyone in a country as much access as they can have? So kind of moving to what are these educational systems of education, rather than the individual, which is, is the main focus of the book, or institutions, but to actually think about what kind of systems are transformative and inclusive, rather than kind of just at the level of institutions. And I'm now just seeing Tiffany's comment on the need to emphasize 21st century skills. And in a way, again, within the book, I kind of set up a slightly artificial definition of generic skills to make my argument. And my view is, and this is what I think the capabilities research does beautifully, is how do we get a notion of capabilities that include knowledge and include skills together? That for me is part of what higher education needs to have a far better account of, not kind of simplified graduate attributes, but not kind of simplified generic skills, but knowledge-rich descriptions of the particular capabilities that studying particular degree programs give you. And that for me would give a far richer account of what universities offer.
Thank you so much, Paul. People, we've run about 5 minutes over time. Sorry about that, but I think it was worth the extra minutes. I can only encourage you to read the book, everyone, and some of Paul's other papers. They align really nicely. Thank you for being here, Paul. Thank you so much. This is clearly a topic that is ripe for a lot more discussion, and hopefully we'll all go away and fertilize the seeds that have been sown and come back in due course for further discussion. Thank you. Thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks to Bertha and for the questions.
Thanks everyone for the really insightful questions, for Bertha's great comments, and for Fenella's brilliant sharing. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you.